Okay, so let's get started with the French braid. I'm pulling the hair, separating into 3 sections, and I'm trying to drag the hair down about 1/2 inch to 1 inch before actually starting the braid. I'm also going to be adding hair, as you can see, synthetic hair that is going to be added gradually. I didn't add it at the beginning because then it forms a small knot, big knot, whatever knot. I prefer not to braid my braids for a closure with a knot. That's just my preference. I see girls do it all the time. Maybe it doesn't make a big difference. It's just what I do. So continue to braid that down. Adding the synthetic hair does help to keep the braid tighter longer. So as you can see, this is the braid pattern. I have this perimeter braid that's going all the way down. You want to really make sure that you have a good braid around the entire perimeter. Now, what I'm pointing out to you right now is the direction that I'm going to actually sew these braids down. What you don't want to do is bunch them all together and try to use one string of thread to go through all of them. You also don't want to do this because this causes bunching at the bottom. Now, some girls do this, but I've spoken to my clients before and they have specifically requested me not to do this because when they wear it, it feels weird when it starts to grow out. I also want to point out the size of these braids. They're not itty bitty, but they're definitely not huge. Super important for flatness. Now I'm going to add oil to her scalp. The oil that's in this bottle is an MU oil that I got from one of my clients that sells products through a line called Cherokee Naturals. It does not come in this bottle, but I continuously use this bottle because it has an applicator top. I like to put oil on the scalp of my clients. They usually like that I do that as well. Just make sure you don't put too much oil, but it's very important to keep the scalp hydrated and healthy underneath the weave, okay? So what I'm doing now is I'm actually taking the braids and I need to start sewing them down. I am not lazy when it comes to this part of the process. I think it's really important that you find space in between the cornrows to put the remaining braids in between. Obviously, when you're on this one right here that just closed off the beehive, you're going to have to go down a little bit, but eventually you want to curve that up so that it can be in between 2 braids, because that is how I achieve the flattest bases. And ladies, I always get complimented on my flat bases. Even if the weave don't come out slamming, even if nothing else is perfect, the braids are always good because I really am not lazy on this part. So please keep this in mind. Now, sometimes you are going to braid women's hair who's extra thick and their braids are extra close together, so it makes it a little bit more challenging, but if you kind of have to dig it between the two, kind of like what I'm doing right here, do what you got to do. It's always worth it in the end, okay? Now, when you finish this off, you just want to make sure that you knot it enough times. Like every time that you finish off a braid, make sure that you knot it enough times so that the thread does not come loose, because I've had that happen as well. And you know, you live and you learn. So I just wanted to show you guys this to show you like all the way to the end product that the base is flat the entire way. When I cut my string, I like to leave about 1 inch or 1/2 inch left, because when they go in to try to cut their weaves out, sometimes it's hard to find the string. So this is the finishing look for the braids. As you can see, there's that 1/2 inch to 1 inch space before the braids start. And so now the first thing that I do when I'm doing a weave that has a closure is I like to lay the closure down. Everybody does it different. I like to do it this way. I aligned the part that has already been made in the closure with the part on her head. And I just made my first stitch. Now, since this thread is up at the top, I don't want to leave any thread remaining. That's why I cut that right there. So as you can see, I put my first stitch through the closure first, and now I'm doing an underhand stitch into the braid first, through the closure, and then pulling it out. I have found that when I braid underhand stitch into the braid first, into the closure, that it just works out well for me. I'm also looping it through the thread and bringing it all the way down to the edge of that closure. Then I'm going to make sure that I have a secure knot, and I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. Now you will want to ask for your client's participation in holding this down because you don't want to drag it too far over. It's really important in order to get these closures to lay flat without glue that they're pulled tight on each side, but you don't want it to be pulled so tight on one side that you displace the closure from the part, because that's how it looks the most natural, is when the part from the closure lays directly on the part that you parted in her head. Okay, so I'm doing the same thing on this side, underhand stitch through the braid first, through the closure. And I want to let this video play out. This is the long length video. As you know, I do have shorter length videos of this exact same install uploaded on my channel, and it pretty much takes you section by section, but this one is going to take you through the entire process, and I just want you guys to see me doing it. Okay, so if you've seen really quickly just now, there's still some lift to this closure. I'm not quite finished yet. I'm actually going to go through and finish tacking it down later on, but this is the side of the closure I wanted you guys to see. I continuously do underhand stitching. I'm stitching through the closure in maybe centimeter increments of stitching. You don't want to go like a long distance between each stitch because that's what causes bunching. Every time that I get to a braid, then I actually run the needle through the braid first and then through the closure. But even if it's not on the braid, just make sure that you are putting it through the closure, stitching through the closure, because you don't want it to bunch. And if you don't take my word for it, just go ahead and try it yourself and you'll see exactly what I mean. Okay, this part shouldn't be too hard. Your number one focus should be to prevent the closure from bunching. Try to keep consistent stitch pattern until you get all the way to the back. Now, I'm pretty sure you've already watched other YouTube videos breaking down how to install a closure, but just in case you haven't, what you typically do is you stitch down both sides, going back, trying to make sure that you don't cause bunching, and you do each side first before you do the entire back. So I'm finishing off this side right now, then I'm going to go do the other side, then we're going to finish off the back of the closure. Okay, now just as an added bonus, because this video is supposed to be giving you extra tips that you don't get from all the videos, some stuff that I've learned when installing closures, and by no way do I mean to imply that I'm an expert at closures, because I do not think I am, but I have learned a lot. And one of the things I've learned is that once you get to the back of this closure and you start stitching, it is very easy to pull the closure further back away from the scalp, away from the hairline, than you intended to in the first place, which is part of the reason why I leave space in the front. As you can see, the little flap right there, and I'm going to anchor that down later on. That's part of the reason why, because you don't want to start and the very front tip of the closure starts at the very front tip of this person's hairline, and then you accidentally, pull it back from stitching so tight in the back that now the closure is already pulling backwards. That's what happens to closures down the line after maybe a month or two, but you don't want that to happen right away. So that's just an extra little bonus tip that I've learned. I prefer to leave a little bit out in the front at first. So underhand stitch through the braid through the closure. Underhand stitch through the braid through the closure. Doing it this way really helps to prevent from unnecessary bunching, and it really helps you to just kind of keep the closure aligned properly. And like I said, don't believe me, go out there, experiment yourself. You see how I have my client holding the closure in the front because I left the little tiny flaps? That's very, very helpful. Okay, so now our closure stitched down until I go back and anchor the rest. We're going to get started on laying these tracks. Now she is using 3 bundles, I believe, so we definitely doubled the wefts. I'm sticking the needle through the bottom braid first and then through the wefts. I'm so sorry. The first thing I did was I did stick the needle through the wefts, and then I took it through the bottom braid and back through the wefts. I like to knot it, and then I go through and I do an underhand stitch. Usually what I'll do is I'll do anywhere between 3 and 5 stitches, and then I'll do an overhand stitch like what you're about to see me do now, and I'll make sure that this one goes through both wefts because that's going to make it tight. And then I knot it. This helped me a lot on my journey in learning how to do weaves efficiently, fast, and still tight. It's okay, every single stitch does not have to go through the weft, but it is important that every 3 to 5 stitches you do put one through the weft, because that's going to make sure that these tracks aren't moving all over the place. Down the line, as the hair starts to grow out and loosen, it's very easy for that to occur. So now I want to show you guys how to flip. Now, people always say flip the track in the videos that I've seen, but I never really see how to flip it, so I kind of had to figure this out on my own. What I just did was I laid the track over, and then I'm doing an overhand stitch, and I'm not taking it directly through the weft, but I am making sure that the track lays kind of like angled down for like the first couple of stitches, and then I'm pulling it up. So as you can see, it was angled down at first, and then I just pulled it up to add that stitch, because I do want it to go straight across horizontally. But when you're flipping tracks, if you make it like, if you sew it down at an angle down just a little bit before you continue with the horizontal pattern, that's what helps it still lay flat in the end. Also, when you get to the edge of your stitching, like the edge of the track on the, or the edge of the hairline, I always like to make sure that I put the needle through the wefts there and knot it tightly. Now, I am going to have individual videos going over every single one of these phases in the sewing process for this closure install. So when you watch the video that talks about flipping tracks, I'll go into more detail, okay? So what I'm doing right now is I just sewed her hair all the way up to a little bit past half of her head, and now that her tracks are only about an inch or an inch and a half away from her closure, it's time for me to anchor. This is my preference in anchoring, and I kind of just made this up. So as you can see, I made a part in the closure. This part was pretty much like in the center of the remaining little like half an inch, quarter of an inch little flap that was left out in the front. So I kind of drew it down the center because I want to go through and I actually want to put a stitch in between this part where you won't be able to see it, like she won't be able to see it herself, but it is there, and it allows me to really tack this closure down tightly. Now when it gets to this part, I put it through, and I'm going to do one more overhand stitch. What I just did was I moved forward a little bit, and now I'm bringing it through that track. I'm making sure that I'm putting it through the actual weft of the track. Now I moved it forward just a little bit more, and I'm going to put it through the weft of the track again. And as you can see, I'm pulling slightly. You don't want to pull too tight and like hurt the person. I always make sure that I ask the client like how they're doing as far as pain level, because it's very important. So now that I did that, I'm going to do the same thing on the other side, and by me pulling it just a little bit on the other side and making sure that I did the steps exactly as I explained, making sure that I'm doing the stitching through the closure a little bit first, and then